We are live.
Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Corinne Podger and I'm delighted to welcome you to this session. As it says there on the screen or at the bottom right hand side of the screen, I run a consultancy which is called the Digital Skills Agency. I design and run training in audience engagement, strategy, social multimedia, and how to bring those together in product design and revenue diversification. And in September, if you look at my pinned tweet, I'm running a program that brings people together on collective learning to solve problems around how do we diversify our revenue. I've also worked for WAN-IFRA many times before and have visited India delivering training there, and I really do wish you all the very best and wish I was there in person. So our next speaker, and I have huge pleasure with this session, is Dmitry Shishkin. So he is a wonderful consultant specialising in digital transformation, content strategy and innovation, drawing on his many years as a senior executive leading change at the BBC and more recently with Culture Trip. He also serves as a board member for the World Editors Forum. He is a superb thinker and a true visionary for our industry, and it is my immense pleasure to introduce him as your next speaker.
Corinne, thank you so very much. You always have been very, very generous with your time and with your expertise as well, and I'm delighted to be here. I also wanted to say that my connection with India always have been very, very strong, especially when I was helping the BBC to launch new teams a few years ago, and one of the highlights of my time at the BBC was exactly around helping different types of language teams at the BBC to connect with new audiences across India as well. So India has a very special place in my heart, and I'm delighted to be able to speak today. I'll try to whiz through the presentation quite quickly. Lots of concepts which hopefully will not be not familiar to many of you, but if you have any questions, I will endeavor to reply. Get in touch with me on LinkedIn, get in touch with me on email. That I will be really, really happy to respond. So let me share my screen and I'll go into the presentation, probably about minutes or so, and then we'll get into maybe 25 minutes and then 10 minutes for questions or something like that.
Fantastic. Right, okay. Just while you're sharing your screen there, Dmitry, I'll just mention to folks that there is a live Q&A button. So if you want to ask a question, and please do, just make sure you pop your questions in there.
So I wanted to share my thoughts on my experiences around how digital publishing can become much more effective if it transforms itself into or around a news user needs model. So news user needs have been around for some time. I'm sure that if you have been in the industry for some time, you have already been exposed to them, but thinking never stops. I'm really interested and actually privileged to share some of the findings, some of the very recent findings about news user needs with you. So Corinne has already introduced me, so I won't spend a lot of time on this. 20 plus years as a journalist and editor, chief content officer before at Culture Trip, and more recently for about a year or so, independent digital consultant working with media organizations and tech organizations, both sides of the aisle, think about content and audience engagement and stuff like that. So I'm also board member for World Editors Forum at WAN-IFRA. I would like to start with reminding you of this really classic slide from Ben Thompson, who writes strategy columns. So we all are in content creation frame of mind, and we also know that basically success to all of us, irrespective of what kind of media organizations we represent, success comes when you think about two really important X's here. So, and the X's are in front of you. You really need to be focused on what you would like to do for your audience, and you really need to deliver the best quality in that particular area. So success always comes on the intersection of that focus and quality. And because we are dealing with digital, there is a myriad of digital niches that you can really target, irrespective whether you are a niche publication, a large publication. There is a myriad of ways of satisfying your audience, and news user needs come really central in that thinking. why news user needs have become such a big thing in the past few years? Well, first of all, we all know that hard news is not enough to attract people regularly with sufficient engagement. People are not interested in just being updated all the time. We also know, and Indian market is probably one of the best examples of that, is that how oversaturation of commodity news, and by commodity news I'm talking about agenda news, something that everybody is writing about exactly the same. So we need to talk about relevancy, we need to talk about unique takes, we need to talk about engagement. Those things become a real differentiator. And time again, since I started working with news user needs at the BBC in 2017 and all the way to 2021, I see that happening time and time again in many newsrooms. You've got there is a huge misalignment between what audience wants on digital platforms and what it actually gets from news publishers. There is this misalignment leading to wastage, leading to production, leading to the content created that is not really needed by the audience. And newsroom's mission, all of us should be very clear about how we are different from each other and what is our mission. And those missions almost always, if you are set up correctly, almost represent different user needs, specific user needs very well. If you don't really know what your audience's user needs are, those newsrooms are drifting, those newsrooms are stagnating, those newsrooms are actually not getting enough traction. And I'm not talking about the absolute numbers, I'm actually talking about relative numbers. So the engagement levels are going up. Because if you don't really know what your audience needs are, you effectively will be losing the audience and your engagement will go down as well. Growth, on the other hand, actually always comes when your individual user needs of your audience are satisfied consistently, strategically, and creatively. And this is not only me talking. If you have been reading Neiman's Lab predictions for 2021, those dark green background snaps are from Neiman Labs. Some of the things that people have been writing about, some of the predictions, people are talking about user needs all the time, and I'm really delighted to see how this notion of creating your newsroom operation based on user needs has really taken off. In comparison to how it was when we at the BBC were the trailblazers of it. And I'm going to show you a few examples, which you will see what I mean. And also, you are hearing the first LinkedIn post about this coming from me very soon. This is what actually unites news publishing and pasta. I was looking at this new news story that a new type of pasta has been created. And I just realized that actually pasta in itself has actually three really specific things that audience, pasta eaters, actually expects from different types of pasta. One of them is sauceability, how well sauce adheres to pasta. Another one is forkability, how easily the pasta stays on the fork. And the third one is tooth sink ability, how satisfying it is to sink one's teeth into it. And I was thinking, oh my God, this is exactly the type of thing that I have been talking about for the last several years. News have exactly the same attribute. If one of those things are missing, you're not likely to be presenting your own, you're not likely to be playing to your strengths effectively. So bear with me. We talk about different attributes of pasta and why this makes sense for the news. Here, why it makes sense for the news. This is a classical BBC example of BBC user needs. Most of you probably will have already seen it. We have found out that people wanted to be updated from news, but they also want to be educated and given perspective and diverted and inspired and kept on trend. All of those different user needs exist at the same time. Majority of newsrooms are blind to that notion, and they keep bombarding people with update me, and the balance is almost always not right. This is another classic slide from several years ago, and again, it doesn't really change. I'm going to show you some of the more recent examples, but this slide basically represents everything that is basically wrong with digital publishing. Newsrooms outputting stuff that is not needed. You can see the red line here on this chart is about the number of stories created per each of the 6 user needs. The gray bars represent the popularity of those user needs with audiences. And you can see this particular BBC team was creating enormous amounts of update me stories, but actually the feedback and the audience engagement actually was coming when they were creating different types of stories. And when I was working with the BBC here on the left-hand side, you can see at the top, you can see the old BBC teams that already existed. And at the bottom, you can see the new teams that were launched, and 4 of them were actually from India. My job as digital development editor there was to actually get 41 different editorial teams to move over to the user needs model. And they were small, medium, large teams from 5 to 150 people. Took us a few months to get going, to apply user needs model to the editorial operation, to the data operation, to the product operation. But that's where the most interesting things started to happen, because once you start to understand your user needs, once you start commissioning content according to the user needs, once you start experimenting with formats and genres and user needs all mixed together, the output gets optimized and the output gets much more effective. You don't really deal with wastage anymore. Weekly articles go down because you actually don't need to produce as you thought you needed, but actually the engagement goes up. This is an example of that work of using BBC Thai team from several years ago. So you can see we have managed to get the normal overall number of articles down, and but at the same time, the overall audience engagement was actually going up. So the team used to create 100 articles per week, started to create 60, but actually the audience almost doubled at the same time. So because people were able to actually think about user needs much better, think about individual articles much better, and actually address the wastage. And this was another example. So I've shown you the previous example from the BBC Russian team, where an Inspire Me user need was doing much better than Update Me user need. So we decided to actually create a growth hack. And growth hack is something that I'm dealing with my clients all the time right now. When you create a hypothesis about certain things, you run a hypothesis, you run a test around that hypothesis for about a month, and then you see what happens. On this slide, the team really didn't want to believe that Inspire Me stories would really be bringing a lot of value to them. So we said to them, well, why don't you create an Inspire Me growth hack where you will be creating Inspire Me stories for a month? And this is what happened. You see on the right-hand side, you see the results of Inspire Me pilot, which ended up being twice as impressive as initial results from Inspire Me stories, and it ended up being about 3 or 4 times more effective than Update Me stories. So this system absolutely works, and this example was taken from one of my recent clients, a regional publisher in Europe. You also see, whilst Update Me stories on the right have been doing quite well, but the overall number of stories was not was too high for that particular user need, because as soon as you started creating stories according to other user needs, Keep Me on Trend, Inspire Me, Divert Me, you can see how much more popular they were in comparison to the initial breakdown. So the BBC model from 5 years ago is quite a unique way, both unique and universal way of applying user needs to your editorial strategy. This regional publisher supported our theory. This was another client of mine, a national publisher, which actually had a paywall behind the some of the content behind paywall, and that was their business model. And we also analyzed some content which was given to the audience for free and some content that was given to the audience behind the paywall. And we also saw some of the misalignment of the actual user needs for that particular brand and the output. You can see that the audience at the top, the newsroom, was creating a lot of Give Me Perspective articles, second from the right at the bottom, but actually maybe they were overdoing it, because actually people who already were paying for news, they were also expecting not only the analytical pieces around Give Me Perspective pieces, but actually they wanted to be kept on trend, they wanted to be educated, they wanted to be inspired. And being really, really clear with your newsroom leaders, with your product people, with your data people about what your user needs are is central to this thing. If you know what your user needs are, you will know what your list of priorities should be. So those quotes are typical quotes that you get from growth hacks, from analysis, from deep dives, when you go and start disseminating that information about user needs and start really analyzing it properly. Like, look at this. 75% of output brings only 12% of page views. Like, what do people do with the rest? Nothing. Educate me is the least used user need, but it has the highest percentage of loyal readers. Really important thing to know, really important thing to create those new editorial projects around. Or logged in users love Inspire Me articles, in read depth of those articles is the highest across the site. So this is a clear indication of what logged in users need, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to go through all of them. You are all seeing it and being able to read it anyway. But you see that the insights around user needs immediately open your eyes to the white spots, the blind spots of what you didn't really think or consider before. And this is your remedial work, which needs to be happening very, very quickly. And the BBC were not the only ones who created those user needs. I've recently collaborated with a great content analytics company called Smart Octo, where we were doing a project which I will speak just in a few moments about a little bit more. But we also made a point that I was collecting user needs from around the world. I know that Wall Street Journal has its own user needs model. Vogue International has its own user needs model. Turkish broadcaster TRT have its own user needs model. Some of them were consistent with the BBC model, which I said was quite universal. Some of them actually decided to go away with get rid of some of the BBC user needs, identified BBC user needs, because, and rightly so, sometimes they would use another word to demonstrate those or to describe those user needs. But the point here is that if you are going to be much more effective, much more successful with your audience if you always start with their own user needs. This was a BuzzFeed example, roughly broadly appeared in the world roughly at the same time as the BBC was doing its own model. TRT, clearly inspired by the BBC model. A lot of things are quite similar there. Condé Nast, Vogue International was using some of the BBC thinking, but also introduced some of their own internal user needs ones. Wall Street Journal has 6 user needs, which are, some of them are very similar to the BBC system, some of them are adding something extra. Believe it or not, guys, Google search has a user need model, and this really drove that message home, that if one of the most successful organizations in the history of the world are using user needs at the center of all of their thinking, publishing sector really should follow. When I went to Culture Trip, I was delighted to be part of that startup for about a year and a half. I think I was brought in because they already had been thinking about user needs at the heart of the travel-related content. Because people who want to travel need to be inspired, they need to be oriented around the places, they need to be helped with planning and with booking. So our content strategy at Culture Trip was also based solely around user needs. And then suddenly, this company, wonderful company called Smart Octo, came to knocking to me, and they said, "Well, let's do a project together." So we did a project together, which the white paper available to everybody. You can go to their website and download the white paper. It is going to be extremely relevant to everything you do. We have created a hypothesis where we thought, well, what if we can create an algorithm which will understand different user needs automatically, recognize them in real time, and then we will be able to send really smart notifications to newsrooms around how to help them with the right stories better, how to commission stories better. What is this? What are the blind spots which they are completely unaware of? So we called it N project, News Need Notifications. We worked on it with several publishers from around the world to kind of try our hypothesis. And then we created a white paper where we basically wrote about our experience and wrote why this is so relevant to anyone, irrespective of your niche or your beat. Actionable user need. It's not enough to know about user needs. It's also about really important to understand what you're doing with it afterwards in your newsroom conversations. Look what happened. Like, we took 3 clients who were helping us with this, 3 different publishers from around the world. This was Omri Brabant, a regional player in the Netherlands. So initially, analyzed their own output and broken down the user needs into functional and contextual. This was the breakdown: 73% for functional, 13% for emotional, 14% for contextual. One is that actually sticking to different user needs and satisfying different user needs is better. You can suddenly realize, you see, they ended up having a much better breakdown of those user needs, and because the breakdown was better, the actual results of audience engagement were always better, also better. I'm not going to go deep through these slides, but it's fair to say that having worked with Omri Brabant, De Morgan in Belgium, and also IDN Times in Indonesia, both the article's performance on the page depth level and both the article performance on the engaged visitors level, all of those numbers went up as soon as those newsrooms started moving over to the agenda-based coverage, to the user needs-based coverage. You still cover the same news, but you're covering them differently. And look at the numbers. The numbers were all going up, and the newsrooms who understood the importance of user needs will end up being more successful than those that do not. And I will finish with just a quote, which is a quote which I just suddenly kind of occurred to me, that we always have been consistently obsessed with finding the right angles in digital journalism, right? We always think about what is the angle to the story, what is the angle to the story. But actually, I think that finding the right angle in digital journalism specifically often means finding the appropriate user need to satisfy with this particular story. Once you put that thinking into the head of your editors and your managing editors and your correspondents, really interesting things start to happen. So thank you for your attention, and do please get in touch if I can help your newsroom, because we know that there are lots and lots of things we can do on the intersection of data and product and content. So thank you for that, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
That was wonderful, Dmitry. Thank you so much, as always. So we do have some questions. So I'm going to start with the ones on the left-hand side of my screen, and then I'll come back to the right-hand side of my screen. So dear friends, please do take the opportunity to pop some extra questions into the chat. So let's start with this question from Abhijit Thite. He's actually asked two questions, and the first one is, what about clicks and follows? A lot of newsrooms are still prioritizing this. Do they need to change that strategy?
Sorry, can you repeat the question, because I think that there was a delay, slight delay on the line. Not
a problem. So Abhijit is asking, do a lot of newsrooms are still prioritizing clicks and follows and likes and so on. How good is that as a strategy in the context of what you're talking about? Do they need to think about it differently?
Well, one doesn't exclude the other. The most important thing here is to remember is why you exist as a media organization. Like, what is the point of your organization in comparison to others? Remember when I talked about the importance of really connecting the user needs with the mission of the organization, you suddenly realize, well, actually, if I'm creating something which is not connected to either the mission of one, and if this is not specific enough and not differentiated enough competitors, then you might as well not bother. Because if you're creating kind of run-of-the-mill articles which are exactly the same as everybody else's, then it's a losing game. So I would start with, the clicks and the engagement and all of that is still very, very important, and the social media engagement is all very important, but you can be much more effective with it if you initially create content that is satisfying the user needs of your audience specifically. Because when I mentioned strategy quote from Ben Thompson specifically about that, because that focus and that quality, only those two things will actually get you to success, nothing else.
I do want to come back to user needs later on in the Q&A, but let's go through the questions here, because I think it's often frustrating if the presenter, the moderator asks all the questions and we don't get to the ones that are in the chat box. So I'm going to do it the other way around and go through them all. So Karim Al-Wahid says, one of the slides from your presentation said something like, hard news doesn't always get a lot of attention or interaction. Sorry, would you please elaborate? So I'll ask it again. You mentioned that
Oh,
hard news doesn't. Oh, have we lost Dmitry? We may have lost Dmitry. That's interesting. It may have just been a connection problem at his end. So we'll give him a couple of seconds to hopefully rejoin us. Oh, this is interesting. Well, actually, Sherilyn, I might be able to answer that one. I'm working on designing a climate change program at the moment, so I might just fill in while we wait for Dmitry to rejoin us. Sherilyn is asking, what do you do on a difficult subject like climate change, where there is low traffic, but it's important that news organisations cover it? And the emerging consensus, Sherilyn, seems to be that taking a solutions journalism approach is at least one way of approaching climate change stories, because rather than this thing has happened, it encourages journalists to instead cover, this is how people are approaching solutions to this problem. And you bring the same journalistic rigor to your stories. So you're still interrogating the solution in the same way that you would interrogate the problem. But it does then allow really a more human face to be put on these problems immediately. And it throws up lots of great story ideas. So, you know, these people are trying to solve this problem this way. Here's the solution that they're giving it a go. You know, this is whether it's working or not. And you really try and do rigorous evidence-based work. And I think the other thing too, you know, is I've been thinking about this a lot in preparing journalism training around climate change. I think we need to take our game much more strongly to scientists and encourage them to communicate more effectively with us. Now, we are back with Dmitry. Hello, you fell off for a minute there.
Hello, sorry. I'm so glad that I'm back. Sorry, guys.
I'm very glad that you're back too. So we have 10 beautiful minutes, which is great. So the question that we were asking was, and it really is looking at the different kinds of content, right? So inspire me, educate me, etc. Karim Al-Wahid asks, one of your slides talked about hard news not always getting a lot of interaction. Could you talk about that a bit more, please?
Thank you for the question. I think it's really important that we clarify a couple of things. Well, first of all, we know that people generally are either interested in hard news or they get really tired with hard news. So they would come if something major happens. I'm not advocating we are not covering hard news. All I'm saying is that you apply 6 different needs to those hard news every day. So, you know, something happens, instead of writing an update me article on that particular topic, you actually apply a different user need to that article. So you do a give me perspective piece on that article, or educate me, or inspire me. And this is really important because the user needs exist, not they're not aligned to different topics. So it's not about, you know, inspirational is all about, you know, lifestyle or entertainment. No, you go out and you have a really robust newsroom conversation around different user needs, specifically at the point of morning editorial meeting. So you don't just come and say, well, you know, today is the Trump inauguration, but everybody will be writing about Trump inauguration. So if your organization is known in the market for, you know, in-depth investigations or, you know, explanatory journalism or, you know, lighter coverage, those user needs are going to be your beacons on how do you need to cover that. So absolutely cover hard news. I mean, that's what news journalism is all about, but don't just default to update me coverage.
Excellent. We have 3 questions, which all are really around transferability of concepts, right?
Yeah.
So I'll read all of them and because I think they sort of, the answer will kind of tie together. So lovely Niharika Raina. Hi, Niharika. Can the model that you did for the BBC work in Indian media, especially in vernacular languages? Abhijit Theta says, what about regional media sites? Will the same business model work there also? And Srinath Golapalli says, will BBC time model work in countries like India? So it's really transferability.
And I'm delighted again with this question because this is exactly the right question to ask. First of all the new BBC teams that were launched in, was it 2018, I think, they were actually launched according to this model, specifically for the Indian market, specifically in all the languages where which we launched those teams in. So Marathi, Telugu, Gujarati, Punjabi, they all had those 6 user needs at the core of their output. They still do. And it's really important to say that when it comes to regional coverage or local coverage, well, one of my clients in Europe decided to give me prospective user need and educate me user need into one, and introducing a new one, which I think every single regional or local news publisher needs to have. It's the user need that is called make me feel connected to the area I'm in. And this is like for all regional and local publishers, this is the most important user need to really build trust and relationship with people in a really meaningful way. Make me feel connected to the area that I live in. So I was talking to American publishers, local American publishers. I was talking to European local publishers. They all understand it very well without even really asking the audience first. But I would argue that try to think less about your gut feeling and always go back to the audience and ask them why they would consume something from you or from anybody else. That's how user needs came about. So talk to the audience, understand what they are. Maybe the audience will say, well, I'm not interested in being kept on trend. Like I don't need it. And if the majority of your audience feels like that, don't produce that coverage. It's just that majority of people will come into the newsroom meeting and have a conversation about all the stories that are happening in the world from the agenda that somebody else will have prepared for them and send out as a planning editor or something. And the conversation always go around, this has happened, let's go and cover it. But likely to be late because somebody else will have already covered it in that way already. And B, you don't really have anything original to say connected to the mission of your own organization. So make me feel connected. And you know what? The fascinating thing about user needs is that I'm just working with a purpose mission-driven newsroom, and we are creating user needs for them, and they are slightly dissimilar to the BBC user needs. They are actually around the needs of the audience that is going to read that particular purpose-driven organization.
Okay, now Aravinda Nevada has asked a question, which I'm actually going to loop into one of my questions. So he says, or she says, actual content, is it taking a back seat because of SEO and technology? Now, that relates to a question I wanted to ask you. And it's really, I guess, digging into user needs, right? So time and again, when I'm talking to newsrooms, the thing that they struggle with is data, right? So what should we measure? And then what tools should we use to measure? That's a big stumbling block if you're not from, if you're from an editorial background where, someone else has to worry about all of this stuff. So let's think about, some practical take-homes for people who talk to the audience. What does that mean? What does that look like? What do we do to get those user needs analyzed?
So you start with having an unstructured conversation with the people who you think are your audience. So they might consider you they use you on a daily basis. Or we also talk to people who don't use you, but ask them a series of broad questions about why they consume news in the first place. And you will learn a lot of interesting things that will challenge your opinions on why people consume news in the first place. And so what we have done with the BBC is that we have asked people to keep the track of everything that they have consumed in a week, and then brought all of those people, maybe 100 of them in each place, together in a room where we all were able to still get together in a room, and ask them to sort those hundreds of URLs or headlines manually without any help from the BBC. So just we said, well, here you are, you've got 400 headlines to sort through, group them and think if there are any similarities around those headlines. And the headlines themselves are so critical to user needs because you can write a piece which is going to be giving perspective on a problem to somebody, but the headline will signal update me and you will have failed. So attention to headline is really important. And then you're listening to people, you understand that those are 5 or 6 or whatever user needs you might have. You bring them back to the newsroom, and you don't move the whole newsroom around it, but you take a section and say, well, it seems to me that people don't really like reading about economy because they don't understand half of it. But every time we would write a Q&A about economy or an opinion piece about economy, people really, really love reading it. So make some growth hacks around it. So growth hack is a controlled exercise of a hypothesis built around hypothesis that you have put together. So we said, instead of every time we write about entertainment, we are always late because we don't have enough staff in comparison to big players in the market. So, but people are still interested in entertainment. So let's bring them to use a need inspired piece about entertainment. So, and then you start going. Sports is another really good example. Majority of newsrooms really fail at sports. Majority of them, they don't really know how to do it. They're late. They're always catching up with sports publications. Don't try and outperform sports publications, but find out why would you consume sport from your specific publication and do content according to those needs. So this is kind of a broad thing about it, and a short thing answer about the how to measure and what to measure. Well, I'm quite controversial like that because I will make a statement that not many people like, but I will still make it. I will say, if you have a vacancy, don't rush and hire. You already chances.
Somebody who really understands data very well, because that person that salary will pay for itself very, very quickly,
because you will be creating better stuff based on other people's research. And that's what I will say. So if you already have 10 journalists and you have a vacancy, don't add 11 one, but actually bring a data scientist or business intelligence person in.
You're certainly seeing that in the kinds of roles that are being advertised. I think, if I had a top tip, it would be have a look at the kinds of jobs that people running the newsrooms that you aspire to be like are hiring for. We've got about 40 seconds, 20 seconds on that, and then I can wrap.
Yeah. So, and in terms of the tools, you can all be using different types of tools, with social media tools and general website tools for analysis and for everything else. But always start with a why. Always start with understanding what will make your numbers go up and what will make your financial situation go up. And if it is people for the time being, fine. If it's reading time, also fine. But really be clear. Identify that North Star and stick to it.
Fantastic. Dmitry, Shishkin, thank you so much. And dear friends, join us again tomorrow for India Media Leaders, starting at 2:15 India time. Take care. Oh, we've got extra time. I'm just going to look here in my presenter chats. Suresh, by all means, send me a note to say how much extra time we've got. But we do have a question from Magdu Mohammed, and I do feel we ought to include that, which is, how should news media balance between needs and wants? Should we ignore reader wants and reader content? And I'm going to chuck in a little addendum to that, which is, how is it that our industry, which relies on having an audience, struggles so hard to be audience-centric? What's that about?
I'll start with your question. Your question first, because I think it's something that we all have been thinking very carefully for the last maybe 10 years or so. I think it all boils down to the fact that we have been in broadcast mode for such a long time, irrespective whether we are a broadcast organization or a print organization. We were the custodians of truth. We were the custodians of what's important. And this just doesn't work for anyone anymore. Many of you probably will have already been exposed to a wonderful American company called Harken. Harken are the specialists in audience engagement on all sorts of levels. And when we brought it to the BBC, the biggest cultural shock that has happened. Basically, for people who don't know what Harken is a company that allows you to ask audience the questions, or allows audience to influence the way you cover certain things. So imagine that you have only one trip to the States ahead of the US elections, and you are coming up with maybe 5 different ideas to 5 different cities, and you get the audience to choose, and the audience feels empowered that actually a newsroom really pays attention to whatever audience selects out of the 5 pre-agreed ideas that have come from the newsroom. The audience feels really connected to your way of thinking and your openness and your transparency, it really works. And the same thing, our BBC Health correspondent was almost lost for words when he said, these are the questions that BBC News audience wants to know about health. And majority of those questions, it never would have occurred to me to even cover that. And so the more you challenge your journalists to think like an audience, the better it is, because you know what, we're not writing for other journalists, we're writing for people. And if you are writing, I'm not saying you are, but if you are in the frame of mind of I know what is truth and I'm going to give it to everybody, this will never work, because people will feel that patronizing tone of story selection, or sometimes it's a tone of voice. It's about the people who you invite to represent certain opinions. So this is about diversity, this is about so many things at the same time, but ultimately in the past people were really trying to impress the sector, but all you need really is to impress the audience, frankly. So, and going back to the question about wants and needs, I think they are the same, frankly, because I think that the audience, it's not as if, if your publication is about economy and the audience wants to know something about, a latest scandal in some kind of reality TV show, you will never write about it, and that's fine. But if you're writing about a reality TV show and its impact on different sectors in the US, in the Indian economy, for example, then suddenly it becomes a piece that is topical, but is also relevant to specific angle of your particular newsroom. So always try, like, I love doing those user needs workshops with people where I come and I would say, well, today agenda is X, Y, and Z, or your yesterday's headlines was A, B, and C. Let's apply user needs model to those different headlines, because you will push yourself to think differently. Like if you were all to say, we only can do educate me news today, irrespective of what the topics are. And I'm not saying you should do it, but just to make a point, try harder to think about different angles. And that's why I think that the wants and needs are not different. Like if somebody comes to you because they like to understand something about a particular subject, make sure that it's different, make sure that it's original, make sure that it's, throw away the first three ideas that come to your mind, because those are the laziest ideas that you will have, and they will have already been done by somebody else.
I've been super cheeky, and I've asked to be allowed to ask one last question, and it is something that I know a lot of senior managers and editors struggle a lot with, and that is that you want to take your media house, your organization, your newsroom in a particular direction, and you need buy-in. You need to bring your community with you. In very practical terms, in a minute and a half, how 2 minutes, how have you approached that at organizations like the BBC? How have you brought people along with you? Top 3 tips for bringing the team.
Make sure that everybody uses exactly the same language and your access to data is universal. So your entry point, like your conversation with a product manager, a data scientist, a business associate, and your editor-in-chief need to use exactly the same data points, because otherwise everybody will be using their own ones and it's not going to go anywhere. Relax your decision makers, like make them feel part of the process, make them feel included. Sometimes they are going to be negative because they will feel scared or challenged, and relax them a little bit. And when the relaxation is there, ask them, what do they think, why the audience numbers are not where they need to be? Like, well, tell me, you seem to be doing all the right things according to you. Explain to me why the audience engagement is so low. Explain to me why this so. And there can be hundreds of answers, and that's also fine. But let them talk. Feed what you heard back to them, and come up with a plan and say, well, let's not overhaul, let's not do a revolution, let's do an evolution. Let's take one beat, one correspondent, and try a couple of new things with them.
Wonderful. Dmitry, thank you so much. So wrapping up again, our wonderful guest all the way from the UK, Dmitry Shishkin.
Thank you very much.
It's been such a pleasure as always. I'm Corinne Podger, and of course this is India media leaders, and we will be back tomorrow at 2:15 India time. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.